Welcome to today's Explainer. We're jumping right into an absolutely incredible journey today. We're going to trace three distinct tiers of Earth's evolutionary complexity. We're starting with simple oceanic structures, zooming out to planetary superorganisms, and then diving all the way into the intricate, fascinating depths of the human mind.
530 million. That is exactly how many years in the past our story begins today. Back during the Cambrian explosion, the oceans were this chaotic, wild testing ground where the very first physical blueprints of life were just starting to emerge. Picture a world totally devoid of life on land, where these bizarre alien-looking creatures navigated the murky waters, laying the absolute foundation for everything we consider complex about the vertebrate body today.
So here's our roadmap for the ascent of complexity. First, we'll look at physical complexity. Second, collective complexity, and third, we'll wrap up with cognitive complexity.
All right, Section 1, Physical Complexity and the Evolutionary Blueprints of Life. Let's wind the clock way back. 530 million years ago, we see organisms like Pikaia. This was a super simple stem chordate template. It had a notochord and it swam in an S shape, but it completely lacked complex sensory organs like eyes. Then, fast forward to 518 million years ago, and Mylocomynia shows up. This is the earliest potential craniate, featuring this rudimentary cartilaginous skull. Move ahead to 485 million years ago in the Ordovician period, and the evolutionary arms race really kicks into high gear. The ostracoderms arrive on the scene. These were jawless fish that evolved heavy, biomineralized dermal armor just to defend themselves against these giant, terrifying predatory sea scorpions prowling the ocean floor. It was a brutal struggle for survival, but it pushed physical refinement to the absolute limit, and that eventually led to the late Devonian period and Tiktaalik, the famous fishapod that perfectly illustrates the crazy morphological transition from aquatic fins to terrestrial limbs, literally hauling itself out of the water and onto land.
Now, right in the middle of that vast timeline is what's arguably the greatest biological leap of all, the Gnathostome revolution. Before this, our earliest vertebrate ancestors were mostly passive filter feeders, basically just sifting blindly through the mud, hoping to catch a meal. But acquiring articulated jaws and a biomineralized skeleton, that changed the rules of the game entirely. Think about the jaw you're using to speak and eat with right now. That anatomical marvel traces its direct lineage back to this exact pivotal moment. It allowed early vertebrates to stop sifting and start hunting, becoming active, dynamic predators. This single innovation fundamentally reshaped ecosystems and really allowed vertebrates to conquer the planet.
Moving on to Section 2, Collective Complexity and the Rise of the Superorganism.
Get ready for a crazy statistic. Today, there are an estimated 20 quadrillion ants on Earth. When you weigh them out in dry carbon, ants account for roughly 12 megatons. Just think about that for a second. If you were to put every single wild elephant, whale, bird, and mammal on one side of a giant planetary scale and just the ants on the other, the ants would match or even outweigh them. It's wild. They are a staggering, dominant terrestrial force. They move more soil each year than earthworms, and their sheer mass relies on this massive evolutionary trade-off, abandoning individual autonomy entirely to form highly coordinated biological networks.
And their dominance isn't just a numbers game, right? It's rooted in highly advanced collective behaviors that predate our own by tens of millions of years. 66 million years ago, that catastrophic asteroid impact at the KPG boundary wiped out the dinosaurs. The skies darkened with ash, and photosynthetic plants died off in droves. So in response to this literal apocalypse, ants began cultivating fungi underground. They formed an obligate mutualistic relationship, effectively inventing agriculture. They farmed mushrooms in the pitch black, carefully tending to their fungal crops to ensure their massive colonies survived while the surface world was quite literally burning.
Which brings us to the language of insects and their multimodal signaling networks.
So how do you pull off agriculture and warfare on a global scale without a central leader or a CEO? Well, you need a flawless communication system. Unlike us, ants don't have vocal cords. Instead, they engage in this constant, high-speed, multimodal dialogue. They rely heavily on pheromones, laying down chemical trails to silently signal the path to food or sound an alarm. They also use cuticular hydrocarbons, or CHCs. Think of these as a chemical barcode worn on their armor. They're these specialized waxy compounds on their exoskeletons that let them instantly recognize a family member from an invading enemy. In the pitch-black tunnels of their nests, they use stridulation, rubbing their body parts together to produce physical vibrations. Add in trophallaxis, which is the social exchange of liquid food and hormones, along with antennal drumming, and you quickly realize an ant colony is essentially a hyper-connected information highway.
And this level of decentralized intelligence extends to other insects in breathtaking ways. Take European and Asian honeybees, for example, who navigate using literal geometry and math. The ethologist Carl von Frisch famously decoded their waggle dance, which is this figure-8 pattern performed by worker bees on the honeycomb. The specific angle of this dance communicates the exact direction of a food source relative to the sun, and the duration of the waggle communicates the precise distance. They even emit chemical compounds in localized electric fields during the dance to ensure the message gets through the crowded, buzzing hive. It's literally a masterpiece of collective calculation.
All right, Section 3, Cognitive Complexity and the Milestones of Human Cognition.
Much like that early unarmored fish we talked about earlier was a biological blank slate for physical evolution, philosopher John Locke theorized that the human infant is a tabula rasa, a blank slate. Locke's empiricist doctrine maintained that we are born with a completely unformed mind. Think about your earliest memories for a moment. Were you already deeply you, or did the world painstakingly shape you? Locke argued that all of our vast cognitive complexity develops purely through our experiences, our challenges, and our interactions with the environment as we grow up. Over the last century, some brilliant pioneers mapped out the stages of that psychological growth, trying to understand how this blank slate is actually filled. Sigmund Freud focused on the psychoanalytic side, positing that our basic biological drives shape us through early developmental stages. Erik Erikson took a broader psychosocial approach, mapping our entire lives out across 8 distinct stages of crisis resolution, starting with trust versus mistrust in infancy and ending with integrity versus despair in our twilight years. And then Jean Piaget completely transformed our understanding of cognitive development. He showed how children actively build schemas, which are basically mental models or blueprints of the world. As kids grow, they assimilate new information, moving from basic sensory motor reflexes all the way up to complex, abstract, formal operational thought. It's essentially the architectural blueprint of how a human learns to think.
When you put these two forms of intelligence side by side, a pretty profound philosophical difference emerges in how nature solves the problem of survival. Human intelligence is fiercely individualistic. It relies on a single brain's memory, its unique capacity for abstract thought, symbolic language, and deep personal emotional intelligence. But in stark contrast, ant colony intelligence is completely decentralized. An individual ant doesn't know how to farm fungi or build a climate-controlled nest, but the colony as a whole possesses memories, behaviors, and capabilities that the individual members just don't have. One thrives on the brilliance of the singular mind, and the other thrives on the unstoppable force of the collective.
Finally, let's look at society, morality, and connection, the peak of cognitive complexity.
For us humans, our cognitive complexity reaches its absolute peak not just in how we think, but in how we relate to one another and how we navigate our sense of right and wrong. Lawrence Kohlberg mapped out these levels of moral development, building on Piaget's schemas to show how we step upward in ethical complexity over a lifetime. Step 1 is pre-conventional morality. This is super basic. Think of a kid deciding not to steal a cookie simply because they fear a timeout, or doing a chore just to get an allowance. Step 2 is conventional morality, where teenagers and adults strive to meet the standards set by their families and societies. We follow the laws and rules to maintain social order and be seen as a good person. Finally, step 3 is post-conventional morality. This is a highly complex, internal state governed by self-accepted, universal ethical principles. Here, a person might actually break an unjust law because they have a deep philosophical concern for impartial justice and human rights that completely supersedes societal norms. Traversing from the murky Cambrian oceans to the profound intricacies of human justice, I want to leave you with a thought to chew on as we wrap up this explainer. Looking at these 3 incredible tiers, are we driven more by those ancient, deep biological blueprints locked inside our DNA, much like that very first fish? Are we defined by our societal super networks, heavily influenced by the collective, much like the ants? Or is our true nature defined solely by our conscious, developing, fiercely individual minds? Where does our true complexity lie? Thank you so much for hanging out with me on this journey today, and I really hope this sparks your curiosity to dive even deeper. See you next time.